Well, good afternoon, everyone. And I'm Dr. Kim Williams, for anyone who I haven't met, and it's my pleasure to recruit you and as well as welcome you to our research grand rounds. Had no idea that research grand rounds was going to actually be more popular than medical grand rounds in terms of live audience and people online. It's my pleasure to, the invitation part is that the intent of this is that every person who has a substantial amount of research in their work effort, that's all our PhDs and MD PhDs and anyone else, is invited to present their work. The idea, if you haven't seen it already, if you weren't here last week where we introduced it, is the idea is that when we sit in a room and talk with each other about the research, we will cross-fertilize ideas, and that certainly happened last week, and I hadn't used the word peak negative DPDT in about 40 years. And it was really great to talk with Dr. Boley about that, about his research, and the fact that there are so many clinicians in the room means that we're going to make that merger between our amazing basic research science and our clinical efforts through the translation. Today, and so please, you'll be getting emails and requests to sign up to give your talk. And after we've done all 76 PhDs, we'll start over again, and we can actually have outside speakers too, but we really want to focus on our internal speakers. With that as an introduction, it's my pleasure to introduce my right hand for research, who's been our vice chair for research efforts here at, since I took over 2 years ago, Dr. Aruni Bhatnagar. And so you may have people who rotate with you or your trainees to say, how do I become Aruni Bhatnagar? So you start in India, okay, and you do biochemistry and then do a master's in biochemistry as well. Be a research fellow also in India, and then he obtained his PhD in chemistry in India as well. He did a postdoc fellowship at UTMB Galveston, impressed everyone to the point where they appointed him to the faculty. He was assistant professor, associate professor, and then he was recruited here as a full professor in 1998 in the Division of Cardiovascular Medicine. As you know, he has been a leader in the area of environmental health, and he has done so much in terms of air quality and smoking and all of the things that, but you also may know that he had a big start in diabetes and being the director of the Diabetes and Obesity Center. About 5 years ago, he became a division in and unto himself with a large group of people who were working in the Envirome area. And he's going to talk to us today about the environmental determinants of cardiovascular disease. He's got an amazing track record and a lot to share with us. So with that, thank you, Dr. Bhatnagar.
Thank you, Dr. Williams, for that kind introduction, and thank you for organizing this. Like I said, we never expected it to be such a popular thing, but thank you, everybody, for being here. I'm sure it's not me, the food is so good. So that's the major draw, I think. So, as long as the food is here, I think people will keep coming. So what I wanted to do is to spend the next few minutes to talking to you about environmental determinants of heart disease, and it's certainly something that I'm sure most of the investigators and most of the clinicians don't think of this as something that's sort of in the front of the mind. But I'll sort of give you a general introduction. You can stand over here, Dr. Jacobs. Okay, here. Yes. Now I'm in the interview? Yes. Okay. Oh, okay. And so I thought that I would introduce to you why we are sort of interested in this area, why is it relevant, and what does it all mean, and then show you a couple of sort of community-based experiments that we are doing. Okay. So as we all know, coronary heart disease is a global epidemic. It is a leading cause of death in this country. It's been a leading cause of death since the First World War, and then it has now been sort of become the leading cause of death in all even low and moderate income countries. So even though we can treat the disease, we cannot contain or decrease the level of the incidence of the disease. So there must be something that we really fail to understand about the nature of the disease, but keeps on increasing. It keeps on increasing here, it keeps on increasing everywhere else in the world. So there must be something very fundamental about this disease that we are missing. And so not only that the disease is increasing in other parts, but also in the United States, the American Heart Association thinks that or estimates that by 2030, about 40% of the US adult population is going to be living with some form of heart disease. There was a time that we thought that heart disease rates were coming down and that, this is something that we are going to have a handle on, but in the last decade, the rates have started increasing again, and that's because of the epidemics of diabetes and obesity. So in heart disease, and then the origins of the causes of heart disease seem to be opaque to us. And so we need to understand why this is happening and what we can do about it. And certainly, no amount of treatment is going to stop that, because the treatment is the other end. And so we can keep devising better treatments, but the disease will keep growing. So in order to look at heart disease, we need to not only understand whether it's something that has to happen to humans, that everybody's susceptible, and is it because there's sort of a genetic predisposition of being human. But we know that, our cousins, the great chimps, they are not as susceptible to heart disease as humans are. And in the wild, the very few chimps develop the garden variety heart disease that we know in humans. So what may be the difference? Certainly it's not the genes. The chimp genome has been sequenced. And as you can see here, that the human chromosomes, the chimp chromosomes are very, very similar. That the difference is only about 2.5% between a human and a chimp. And most of the difference are in cognitive genes, not in metabolic genes. So maybe there are some things that are different, but that cannot explain the vast difference in heart disease between chimps and humans. And maybe it's the diet. Maybe the chimps are not eating as much meat as humans are eating, but there may be other factors. So of course, there are the genes, but there's also the environment. And genes and environment are pieces of the same puzzle. And I submit that you cannot understand how genes work and what they do without equal consideration of the environment. And although we have done a lot of work in trying to sequence the human genome, we have understood less about the corresponding entity to the genome, which we call the envirome. The envirome actually is a complex idea. It encompasses all the environmental conditions that affect our fitness and health and that are specific to an individual. So people often ask me, what's the difference between the environment and the envirome? So the environment is like genetics. Like everybody has genes. We share genes with animals. We share genes with plants. Same thing with the environment. We share environment, people around us with animals and plants, but the envirome is specific to a particular individual, just like a genome is specific to a particular individual, right? So we don't need to just understand the environment, because I think we've missed the whole issue. We have to understand the envirome. But understanding the human environment is very complicated because humans exist in very large social networks, and these social networks arise out of our history and culture. And certainly people who are looking at disease and in medicine and in biology have very little understanding of issues of how to understand culture, how to understand people in the environment as they are. And so it becomes a very complicated issue. And similarly, people who are sociologists and psychologists, they don't understand the medicine, they don't understand biology. And so there is this large divide because of which we're not be able to grasp the entire continuum of the disease from its origin to its clinical manifestation. So we have to go back to the very elemental levels in societies, in areas where people live, and try to understand the root causes, literally the root causes of the disease. But we do know this is important because many of the chronic diseases arise from living in unconducive environments that are really not healthy, by living in a state of environmental dysynchrony. I'll talk about this a little bit. And a mismatch between the genes and the environment. We are very close to chimps. We evolved in a completely different environment. And now we live in a very different environment. And so this mismatch is a constant pressure, a constant sort of force that drives this pathology and sort of human disease, particularly chronic disease. But we know that a great extent of the disease, particularly heart disease and diabetes, are environmental in origin. It's been estimated that between 60 to 80% of disease is because of environmental causes. And why do we say that? So I offer a few examples. One is example from Japan, and this is after the bombing of the Hiroshima, when lots of Japanese moved from Japan, actually they moved to Hawaii. And when they moved from one place, one environment to another environment, the risk for coronary heart disease doubled. So suddenly nothing changed in their genetics. So there must be some environmental factors. It's also the reverse. So if this is data from Finland, and in the 70s, Finland had a very, very high rates of heart disease. And then they changed the policy. For example, they cut down on the subsidies for pork and lard and meat, and they started importing fresh fruits and vegetables when they joined the EU. They changed their living conditions and made a concerted effort, and this is called the Finnish miracle, which is a 65% decrease in the rates of heart disease. And so if within the same population, within the same generation, the rates of disease can decrease by 65%, it is difficult to say that there's any genetic basis to disease at all. Finally, the other direction, this is from China. When China opened to the world, they started eating Western diet food, including McDonald's and KFCs, and there was a corresponding increase in heart disease between 50%. So when you have large swings of disease incidence within the same population living in the same area, or a population moving from one area to another area, suddenly there is less confidence to attribute those changes to any genetic reasons, or to some inevitability that just because we are human and we are all getting older and whatever other reasons we come up with. So we cannot attribute that to the other. So there must be a very strong environmental component. We do not know what those components or component may be. But the same thing is also true of cancer. 97% caused cancers are environmental in origin. And so if we are not going to pay attention to the environment, we are not going to understand the root cause of any of the chronic diseases. So how do we understand how the environment is and how to think about that systematically? So we can think of the environment as sort of in three different shells. So there's a natural environment, and sort of nested within the natural environment is a social environment. And then within the social environment, there's a personal environment, the environment we create. So even if your two individuals live in the same social environment, they have very different exposures because, one person may be smoking but not smoking, one may have a better household, the other may not. So with the social determinants of health idea, they miss the natural environment and they miss the personal environment. So the social determinants of health is not completely reacting to the entire reality, but it is limited, and therefore its efficacy has been limited. So we need to understand the environment in a little bit more complicated, nuanced way. The natural environment is the most primordial, and that sort of governs the overall health and well-being of individuals. But overall, all these three domains of the environment contribute to coronary heart disease, and I would say that cardiovascular disease is essentially an environmental disease. We can talk a lot about the social and personal environments, but today I'm going to talk about the natural environment, which I think is the most important, that has the most profound influence on human beings. And we think, we live in artificial environments, why do we care about nature? No, we cannot ignore nature, and it's constantly with us. We are actually in nature. We cannot say, oh, I'm going to go spend time in nature. Like that doesn't even make any sense. So it means that we are always surrounded, we are part of it, and so we cannot divorce ourselves from natural conditions and constraints. So one natural condition, there are many natural conditions about nature, latitude, altitude, sunlight, and so on. And all of these have important bearing, and I'll go through some of the details with that. Let's start with the cycles of night and day. So all life is entrained to night and day. We cannot escape the cycle, even for a few hours. Right? If you try to go to bed later, or try to get up earlier, or try to go get up later, there is a price to pay. So we cannot live in the state of dysynchrony. There is a sort of an inextricable bond between us and the diurnal rhythms. We can see that people who work on shifts have higher rates of obesity, diabetes, and heart disease, and that is because 13% of the genes go up and down every day in unison with the diurnal cycle. So we are completely wedded to that cycle on an everyday basis. We know that if you are sort of short on sleep, sleep is now considered the fundamental aspect of our biology. There is no escaping sleep. And we need to embrace that and understand that we cannot talk about health unless we talk about sleep. So sleep is increasingly recognized as being critical. As you can see here, that there is an increase. This is a meta-analysis of a lot of studies over several thousand people, and it shows that there's a strong evidence that about that lack of sleep can actually increase your BMI. There are other studies showing that there is increased mortality, increased cardiovascular mortality, and even an increase in cardiovascular risk factors. There's a strong relationship between sleep and blood pressure. So in healthy adults, the systolic and diastolic blood pressures are elevated when sleep is restricted. And this can even happen just in a few weeks if people are misaligned in their sleeping habits. And short sleep duration can lead to hypertension. And so there is a strong link between healthy sleep and healthy blood pressure. And this burden is not equal. There's some studies showing that African Americans are more likely than Caucasians to have insomnia, sleep apnea, and daytime sleepiness. In addition, they spend 15% time of the night in deep sleep compared to 20% for whites. And so there is this sort of systematic difference between the quality and the quantity of sleep between different people, and that may be one of the reasons that of the increased rates of heart disease. Nobody's done a study that if we improve sleep quality and sleep efficiency in Black population, would that diminish the risk of heart disease in that population? But there are also areas of where people have better sleep than others, and this is hotspots for inefficient sleep. And as you can see, that the hottest spot on the map is where we are in eastern Kentucky and West Virginia, but there are the people who have the most disturbed sleep. Now, we do not know the cause and direction of causality. I mean, maybe the sleep there is bad because high rates of diabetes and obesity and heart disease in those areas, or they have high rates of heart disease and obesity because of poor sleep quality. But somebody should pay attention to what is happening here, and just in our backyards, there is this lack of sleep, and that's linked to higher incidence of both cardiovascular disease and obesity. But there are other sort of environmental factors. For example, the seasons. We know that the risk factor burden varies with seasons. We know that cardiovascular mortality is lower in summer. And there was a lot of talk about this. Maybe people die of cardiovascular disease in winter because they're indoors, they have influenza, and they get sick, and now it's COVID. But this is a study from Los Angeles, and if you've been there, you know there is no winter to speak of. But even in Los Angeles, you can see a sharp decrease in cardiovascular mortality in summer months. So why that might be the case? Why is it that summer is so critical, even independent of temperature? So one idea may be sunlight. Sunlight is a critical aspect of the natural environment. And what we don't understand, that we are like plants. We undertake photosynthesis just as efficiently as plants do. And this photosynthetic reaction creates vitamin D, which is essential for bone health, for immunology, for cardiovascular function. And because of this big insistence on, oh, we could be in sunlight, you get skin cancer. Now, small exposure to sunlight are very, very critical for human development, growth, and well-being. Children who are exposed to less than 6 hours of sunlight every day cannot form their eyes properly. So they all they have to wear glasses. So every child from the time they're born to the time they're 20 have to have at least 6 hours of sunlight exposure to grow normally. Okay. And so that is the nature of our bond with that is the nature of bond with nature, that we have to be in a certain area. But sunlight exposure and how much vitamin D you make depends upon the skin color. And that's why we have the skin color differences. Depending on if you're in the tropics where there's so much sunlight, the skin is darker. If you're places where there is less sunlight, the skin is lighter. Even when humans migrated from Africa to Europe, the skin color did not change right away because they were eating meat and fish and so on, so they could have enough vitamin D. When Europeans started doing agriculture, there was a positive selection for white skin because you couldn't exist in Europe with the plant diet, which had no vitamin D at that time, without turning white. So that was it. So this is the change in color is a consequence of agricultural revolution in Europe. And it is critical because that determines how much vitamin D we make. So sunlight can not only alter your vitamin D levels, it can also regulate your clock. So we all have a master clock in our brain that gets reset every day so that we can then be synchronized to the night and day cycle. And that could lead to your circadian regulation. Some UV lights can also regulate blood pressure. If you have high blood pressure, you step out in the sun and stay there for a few hours, you see a drop in blood pressure. And so it is really critical to be outside and to be exposed to sunlight. At one time, it was thought sunlight was a treatment for TB, but that was also because in sunlight, you get enough vitamin D to be more immune resilient. But there's also latitude. There are literally dozens of studies showing that people, as you move away from the equator or down from the equator, that the blood pressure rises. So if you go to tropical Africa, the blood pressure is rarely over 110 over 70, and the vitamin D level is about 100 units. In the United States, we say 60 is plenty, but nobody's in the United States or in Europe and Western planets have 100. But all the tropics, even the dark-skinned people, the vitamin D level is 100. So what is the correct human level? We don't know. And when they were measuring blood pressure in the UK initially in 30s and 40s, they thought having for a 60-year-old man, 160 over 110 was a normal blood pressure because everybody had the same blood pressure. When they went to Africa, they discovered no, human beings have lower levels of blood pressure, even at that age. So then they revised all the guidelines, and now we desperately fight to have lower levels of blood pressure. But that depends upon sunlight exposure and maybe latitude, also the amount of salt that we ingest. Then there is the altitude. We know that people who live in higher altitudes are healthier. And there are studies showing that, I don't know whether I have them here, showing that if you live on a higher level temperature, a higher altitude, and even when you migrate down, the health benefits still sustain. So there is something about living in the high latitude that's very good for cardiovascular health. Maybe there is more angiogenesis, more blood vessel growth, maybe more hemoglobin that you manufacture in order to compensate for low levels of oxygen. And there are certainly human beings adapted to that. And the adaptation depends upon their evolutionary history. For example, the Tibetans who've been living in the Tibet Plateau for over 60,000 years are very well adapted because they have increased blood flow, they have greater oxygen saturation during exercise, and they rarely get fetal malformation in hypoxia. When the Han Chinese started migrating and populating Tibet, the incidence of birth defects was quadrupled because the women were not adapted to living in low pressure, low oxygen levels. So there are certain levels of oxygen that people have adapted to. The Andes population is relatively younger. They have been there only for 20,000 years. And so they actually have and I could show you some of the coronary tree maps of people, the Andean Indians. It's twice the density of any Northern European because they live in this environment that have very profoundly more angiogenesis. So it's a very rich and well sort of supplied heart, but they do have mountain sickness. And if you go, there is all this pulmonary diffusion is capacity is large, but they do get this mountain sickness. And certainly people who want to go and climb the Andes get mountain sickness if you're not adapted. This is the study from Switzerland I was talking to you about, that if you moved out, if you're born high up, and you can see that for every 100-meter increase in height and the altitude, that there is about a 12% greater longevity, or greater lower risk of death. And so there is something about the environment there that we need to understand what's doing. The other issue is temperature. I know this is going to be a huge issue now that the temperatures are changing globally, but high and low temperature make a bigger difference. They make a difference not only in how we respond to heat and cold, but how we are made. And so this is a comparison because people who grew up in Africa, who evolved in Africa, and people who evolved in Europe, there were different constraints that they were evolving under. The people in Africa are evolved to dissipate heat. The people in Europe are evolved to conserve heat. And you can see that there are all these differences that the heat adaptation has actually caused about salt preservation, about body composition, and about the shape of the body that's different between the African evolutionary outcomes and European evolutionary outcomes. Particularly, the European outcomes have to have minimum body surface to volume ratio. They have to have higher limb length to trunk ratio. And so these are differences that we need to take into account. And certainly now this has become increasingly important when people are put into different environments with high levels of heat and fluctuating temperature, even cold and hot. So this is the underlying physiology may be different. Finally, there is, in addition to heat, we're going to have high levels of pollution. We know that pollution is been a major issue and a major constraint to good health in a variety of different countries. Pollution was very high in the United States, and even though we've cut down the levels of pollution to a lot in this country, as you've seen the last few years, the Canadian wildfires and local wildfires, they're always very bad days of air pollution, and in about 70% to 80% of deaths in air pollution because of heart disease. So we, as with interest in cardiovascular health, should be particularly cognizant to the effects of air pollution. We know that people who live next to major roadways are actually more likely to have heart disease, stroke, and have poorer recovery than people who live further away from roadways, and that these towns that we have created are not conducive to health, particularly red line areas of town and people who live in these underserved neighborhoods. But one of the aspects that really makes a big difference is our green spaces. And green spaces, we know from a large range of epidemiological studies that they are associated with a decrease in overall cardiovascular mortality. But these are large studies, ecological data, only association, but they do point out to a possible fact that there may be a link between greenness in around us and health. Data from England shows that the rate of cardiovascular mortality in the least green areas is twice that of the more greener areas. So it may have, but this may have to do with a variety of different factors. People who live in more green areas generally more affluent, have a less stressful life, and so we cannot really attribute causes here. But at least that's a start to see, is there a real link between green spaces and health, particularly cardiovascular health? So this is a study that was published a few years ago. It's kind of interesting. So there is a kind of tree, I don't know if you know, it's called the ash trees. And the ash tree was infected by the beetle from China. It's called the borer beetle, and it has killed over 100 million trees in the northern United States. The epidemic started from the northern United States and moved south. And as the years of the epidemic increase, you get a corresponding increase in cardiovascular mortality in those communities. So it means that in communities where trees die, people die as well. So what is this link? And it is a rather startling and unique and sort of unanticipated that such a high influence of green spaces in urban environments and cardiovascular health. These are data showing survival from stroke. And people after stroke have sort of progressive mortality, but those living in greener areas show less mortality than people who live in less green areas, showing that there is something about living in green areas that helps you be more resilient and be able to recover better or have decreased risk of mortality after a major cerebrovascular event. This is the study we completed a couple of years ago, and this is looking at cancer data. And this is a cohort of over 5 million people, about 2 million deaths over 10 years that we looked at in these different states. And we found that people who had high survivability cancer survived more. This is supposedly zero, this is normalized, survive longer if they live in areas of high greenness, NDVI as a measure of greenness. Of course, if you have low survival cancer, the effect is very small, because if you have something like lung cancer, pancreatic cancer, it doesn't make much difference. But if you have breast cancer, stomach cancer, other types of cancers, then you would have much better survivability if you lived in more green areas, right? So again, with the stroke data and the total mortality data, it's starting to build a case that there must be a real, actual link between greenness and cardiovascular health. So how do we explore that further? We know that greenness, we encounter greenness in all the areas, whether it's in a natural environment, a social environment, even in our personal environments. We keep plants and pets and all nature around us. There is this idea that we are sort of attuned to nature. That is called the biophilia hypothesis, that we have to be around nature, whether at all times, even in our homes, so that we could feel a sense of connectedness. Without that, it is a big mental cost and a physical cost. So how does nature help? So one idea is that maybe being in nature could promote you to be more physically active. Certainly, if you live in neighborhoods where there's more green spaces, you're outside, you can be more physically active. So living in greener neighborhoods can increase physical activity.
It can also increase social cohesion. When you're outside, you're with your neighbors, and you are interacting with them. And we are like chimps. We only can survive in colonies. We wither away and die if we are left to ourselves. We only live and thrive as part of social networks, and those are very critical to health. And there's a lot of studies about social isolation and social cohesion, how they have opposite effects. In fact, the Surgeon General has made this that cause celebrate about how social isolation is one of the key drivers of mental health crises in the US youth, and also physical health in middle age and older ages. We know that elderly people who live in isolation have a greater risk of mortality than those who live in social networks that interact with each other. Greenness can do that, it can increase people to be outside and be more interactive. It can also improve mental health. There is a lot of data showing that people who live in green spaces report better mental health, and that they are less anxious, they have lower levels of anxiety, lower levels of depression. And there's an improvement in mental health in every matrix you can measure. Studies from Japan show that people who live in green spaces have lower rates of suicide, and therefore lower rates of crime and anger, and sorts of couples who live in apartments with windows open to greener spaces fight less. So, so there is a great advantage of being around pleasant green spaces. There's also a difference in cognition in children and adults. People, when they interact with other people, it takes energy, it takes attention to focus on individuals, built environment, and the spaces that we are in. But our interaction with nature is effortless. It requires no effort at all, and we don't have to be cognizant of it. And so being in nature restores your attention, your cognition, so that you will feel more alert and awake and be more cognitively active if you have spent time in nature and be able to sort of, at least for a while, time being, sort of away from this constant attention to other people and places. Then there is this idea that maybe being around nature increases immunity. It is called the old friends hypothesis. And the old friends hypothesis is that we evolved with all these viruses, bacteria, and antigen. And then when we are putting ourselves, sequestering ourselves in a sterile environment, we do not face all these antigens. And so our body misses these old friends and doesn't know what to do, so it attacks itself. These old friends are a variety of different antigens, and they educate our immune system. So certainly we have a study showing that, for example, children who live in farms and who are around the animals and who are in plain dirt have really very, very low rates of asthma, and when they grow up, very low rates of autoimmune disease, because their immune system is better educated than the kids who are brought up in cities and washing their hands with antiseptic soap every 10 minutes. So there is this relationship between the other elements of nature that we cannot sever and sort of close ourselves away from other elements of nature. Even we talked about enduring injury. And so this is another study showing people who went in for gallbladder surgery. And when they were brought into the room, they were randomized to a room with a brick wall and a garden view. So people who were brought up back into a room with a garden view required less pain medication and were discharged 1 day earlier than the people who had a window facing a brick wall, right? So it is just being in a more pleasant environment that makes us recover from major illness much better than to be looking at brick walls and to looking at the built environment. So there is this link between nature and a capacity to recover and to be more resilient. So we looked at other things, that maybe what nature does is to have all these mental effects, but we can't actually pursue all of them. Certainly it was not our expertise to look at psychological endpoints. So we thought, let's look at one thing that we can definitely measure, which is, can exposure to nature, can large amounts of green spaces decrease exposure to pollutants? So let's just study one aspect rather than all these other things that I've been talking about. So for that, we recruited all the people from all over Louisville. I think there was about 1,200 people or so. And then we looked at the levels of these VOC metabolites in the urine. And the VOC metabolites, VOCs are like benzene, xylene, toluene, all these other chemicals that we're exposed to all the time. And you can see that people who live in more green spaces at least at lower levels of some of these metabolites. So it shows that when you are around green spaces, that you have lower levels of exposure to these two chemicals. So at least that's a start. We know that. Maybe that part may be true. We looked at the distance of what distance does greenness make a difference. And it turns out that greenness within 100 and 200 meters of somebody's home makes the biggest impact. If the greenness is too close, maybe it's less of a difference. And if you're very far, the effect disappears. So there is something about having proximity or residential proximity to greenness that is important. So we have to sort of think about this, and we want to develop this idea to test it more rigorously. So overall, we find that people who live in low green areas have higher exposures. People who live in high green areas have less exposures, and people in low green areas have higher exposures. We also know that greenness can prevent the effects of air pollution. And this is just measuring arterial stiffness. And it shows that if you are exposed to ozone and PM, your arterial stiffness increases, but you're exposed to greenness, then the effects of this disappear. There's also indication that maybe greenness can decrease the levels of stress. And for that, we measured levels of all the catecholamines and their metabolites in human urine. There's about almost 1,000 people. And we found, at least for epinephrine, that there was a decrease in epinephrine with the increased levels of greenness. And this seemed to be a dose-dependent effect, that the more green area you live in, the lesser levels of resting levels of epinephrine in urine. Certainly consistent with the idea that there is a relationship between stress and greenness. And so that's something that we can measure rather than questionnaires, which are difficult and subject to a lot of variability. But this effect seemed to vary from one place to the other. And in this study, Dan Riggs looked at all the different types of ecosystems in the country and found that the effect was more pronounced in some areas. For example, the eastern temperate forest, maybe even the plains and the prairies, but maybe not so much in the deserts. So it is a sort of ecologically determined effect. And we're still trying to grapple with what this means, is why the effect sort of disappears in northern forests but it's so much stronger in eastern temperate forests. So maybe there's something to do with the type of greenery, with the type of plants that we have, and maybe also the type of interaction we have with them. So all these studies are actually telling us maybe there is all these things. So, kind of building up a case, but really not getting the point, what is the relationship? So in order to get to that more rigorously, we launched this project we call the Green Heart Project. And the Green Heart Project is a project which is a very large project in relationship to, in partnership with lots of different places. This is only a partial list. We have other universities that have joined us since, and they're working together. It is about a 7-year-old project, and hopefully we'll get funded again this year and we'll continue for another 5 years. What we are trying to test is that if you are exposed to greenness in your neighborhood, then there is a decrease in the risk of cardiovascular disease. And this is because greenness can diminish exposure to levels of air pollution. So how do you test this hypothesis? It is first of all, the reason we have this very narrow hypothesis is because, as you know, in all clinical trials, you can only test for one thing, with one primary outcome, with one variable. If you try to put all these variables together, you won't know how to do your power calculations. You don't know how to measure the outcomes, and it is an undoable project. So we had one outcome, which was arterial stiffness, and one exposure, which is air pollution. So what will we do? So first of all, we went to all around Louisville, and we looked at different neighborhoods, and we settled on this neighborhood, which is between Churchill Downs and the airport. And in this neighborhood is a low-income neighborhood. It has 30,000 people living there. And the interesting part is it's a mixed-race neighborhood. About 20% of the residents are Black, and it's only one of the few places in Louisville, if not the country, where we have Black and white residents living together. We did a scan of the neighborhood. So we, rented a plane that came from Atlanta. We put in our, scanners on the plane. It flew over the area to get a hyperspectral scan, so we know what the trees are, which ones are stressed, where are the places we can plant more trees. We did what we call a leaf area index. This is a LiDAR scan of the whole area, the 4 square miles area. So we can actually recreate every single leaf in that area, or every single plant in there. And we can get the canopy. We did the tree height and look at every individual tree that's in the area. If you come to our facility here in Cardiovascular Innovation Institute, I show you, we have a very large map about the size of this room, where we can look at each house and each tree and then plan how we do this work. We call it, I wanted to call it a war room, but people didn't like that. So now we call it the map room. So we have a map room in which you can identify places where you plant trees, where we recruit people. And this is one of the preliminary studies we did there. This is about air pollution, humidity, and temperature. We're looking at sleep. And you can see that with the high levels of pollution, sleep efficiency is decreased, CO2 levels decrease sleep efficiency, noise, of course, decrease sleep efficiency. Sleep efficiency simply is how much time you spend in the bed and how much time you sleep in that time. So, so all these environmental factors make a difference in sleep. So we said we will include sleep in our baseline evaluation as well. So then we had to design this clinical trial. So how do you do a community-based clinical trial, which is you take 8 different neighborhoods, and these are the target neighborhoods. And then there are 8 control neighborhoods. So we will intervene in these neighborhoods, but not intervene in this neighborhood. And so this is a very simple, straightforward clinical trial where the target population gets the drug and the control population doesn't get anything. Instead, if we are not giving any drugs, we're going to plant trees here. And so if we green this area, we can see if there are any differences between these 2 areas. And then within the same area, we can also see as the trees increase and as they grow, whether there is a corresponding decrease in the risk of cardiovascular disease. So for that, we then recruit over 500 to 800 people from from these entire neighborhoods. And we do an in-person exam for all these people. And this in-person exam, we measure blood pressure, lipids, obesity, diabetes, all these other inflammation markers. But again, our primary outcome is arterial stiffness. And we do measure a whole range of other things, including anxiety, depression, purpose in life, and well-being, and so on. And social cohesion. So we measure all of these things, which we have a very comprehensive data. We do this exam every year, every other year. We've done 4 such in-person exams, looking at 500 people at least each time. We're trying to maintain the cohort, and we have had in the last 2 rounds at more than 80% retention. You have to come to the facility. It's almost an hour and a half exam that you have to go through, fill all these forms, and then go through all this physical exam. So we can have then in-person data. It's actually completely designed on the basis of the training study so that we can have a cohort, longitudinal cohort evaluation. We look at all the psychosocial functions, and then we measure air pollution levels in the area. This is a 4 square mile area. We have almost 60 stationary monitors around there. Every week, somebody goes and climbs up on these poles and takes out these tubes and puts new one there. We got LG&E to allow us to put everything on the poles, but they're high enough so people just don't go and remove those. Then we did a whole range of measurements. This is a graduate student going round and round on a golf cart measuring levels of air pollution to see where the air pollution levels are high. And certainly places around the roads were high, but there were other hot spots in the neighborhood. And the reason to do this is so that we can do evidence-based planting. We just don't go plant trees willy-nilly. We know where the levels of pollution are, so we can optimize the planting in those places. So this is, I think, the first time somebody's done evidence-based planting of trees, so they're just not putting trees wherever people like them. But we did a detailed map. We found other hotspots in the area. Some of the worst hotspots were actually fast food places where people idle their cars and generate a lot of air pollution. So we can identify individual spots of air pollution. And then we transplanted large trees. In order to do the experiment, we can't plant trees which will take 30 years to grow. So we have to plant very, very large trees. This makes it a very difficult operation and a very expensive one. The whole project, just the planting the trees is over $9 million. And then doing an evaluation is another $5 to $7 million. And to be able to, first of all, get these resources, get the people to do it. The Nature Conservancy did a global fundraising campaign for the program, and they got us the money to buy the trees. We got a retired colonel to bring his own army unit to coordinate all this. And it took 4 months of relentless work to plant these trees. We had to plant trees in people's homes. We went home door to door knocking to people. Say, can we put a tree in your backyard or front yard? We take care of the tree. We'll monitor it, measure and water it. And so we planted many trees in the neighborhood like that. We certainly were interested in next to the freeways, so that to prevent the pollution of going from the freeway to the neighborhood. So this was the freeway wall that we started working with. We had to clean up the space. We had to bring in new soil that was being planted to remediate the soil there, because the soil around freeways is really bad, won't support any growth. And then we ordered all these trees that came from all around the country, including Oregon and Pennsylvania, and they came in hundreds of trees in one truck. and then we had to put them in the staging area and then transport them to different areas of the neighborhood. And then we brought these trees to the places next side to the roadside places. We got them sort of spaded into the wall, and this is what we got. So this was in the end sort of planting in a tiered fashion. The reason for doing this was to be able to ease the air pollution away gradually from the freeway. And if you have time, you could drive around the South Louisville and look at all this planting. I think that they're even much better and bigger than this. And we got a lot of attention. This is one of the stories that came out of the Washington Post last month. So this was the reason we did this type of planting. This is a computer fluid dynamic modeling showing that if you have a haphazard planting of trees, no trees is bad, but if you do this what we call current condition and haphazard way, it makes things worse. And then if you have a design case, only then you can improve the dissipation of air pollution. Because if you go around the road and somebody's planting these lollipop trees around both sides of the road, they actually accumulate pollution coming out from tailpipes and the understory and make the levels of air pollutants worse at a nose level. So you're not helping anything by planting trees in the wrong configuration or using the wrong trees. So we had to understand the planting geometry to maximize its effect. And then overall, we planted over 8,000 trees in the target neighborhoods, done in the cluster neighborhoods, which is the old trees. They had 20,000 trees there before anyway. We doubled the numbers of trees in the cluster neighborhood. We planted over 42 species, so we had to maintain some biodiversity. We had a whole group of graduate students who come here every summer looking at biodiversity, including arthropods, bats, butterflies, and robins and birds. We actually even measure stress levels in the birds to see if these birds are affected by pollutants, and then if greenness is going to make a difference. We also planted some evergreens, only 600 evergreens over there. So after 4 years, we go there. We have this ambitious plan. We will finish by 2022. We didn't finish then, but I think we're going to continue to do this. And I think we'll be funded, so we can do this another 5 years. So we have 10 years already, and maybe we can get funding again. So this could go on for 30, 35 years. The trees, once they're planted, continue to grow anyway. And we learn how planting trees could remove air pollution, whether it will improve any of the environmental conditions there, the social conditions, and so on. So finally, I want to end by just showing you one last experiment that we are doing. Is called a Traeger microforest. Certainly the Green Heart experiment is our clinical trial is very difficult, very expensive, and difficult to undertake. So, but in order to actually contain the heat that's going to be generated during climate change, we need to have very focused planting. And so we got this square. It's called the Founder Square between 5th and Ali, and from the city, they've leased it to the Institute for 30 years. This was the initial configuration of the place, and we're going to plant, make a microforest there. And if you go drive around there, you will see that we already started digging out. We want to create this really dense forest, and we did experiments about how this space as it is now affecting people when they're there. We're measuring temperature, humidity, pollution, and light, all in that place now, so that once we do this, we can have a before and after results. This is how we're going to make it pleasant, so people can interact with them, with the space as well, so they can go around this area and be able to be there. It's a pleasant space to be, so that there could be actual movement around there. We have to elevate these plants at different levels, so we can plant them in tiers. So the central area will be lifted up higher. And then we learn whether or not planting this, which trees to what density would decrease the levels of heat in the area. And that we could, and how far that effect spreads. And so that be a good social place to be, but also somewhere would be an experimental place to be. So if we learn how the planting and configuration of this planting helps us in decreasing the urban heat island effect, we can do this in other places in Louisville and perhaps all over the world. So the overall idea is to create healthier cities that we can live in, so that we can prevent heart disease, which we know is out of control. And we run out of ideas what to do in order to control heart disease. Even in places like India, where the vegetarianism is so high, rates of heart disease skyrocket. And that's because of pollution and because of unhealthy living conditions. There's no greenness left because there's so much overpopulation. So we need to do that. We can develop a new model of how to live well and be resilient as communities against climate change and against chronic disease. And maybe we can offer some guidelines and building codes that will make our living conditions better. And we're going to do this in a new facility that we are moving there next year. We are not going to move en masse when we develop a whole new program. This is again between 5th and Ali. This is going to be the new home of the Envirome or extension of the Envirome. We're very excited and we invite you to come and partner with us. It is going to be a very pleasant place and it's going to be some things where we can do really innovative work on human physiology and how human beings, how environmental factors affect human beings. And this is a group for now, and hopefully when I come back here in a few years, we will double our people who are in this institute. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.
Glad
So that was really encyclopedic and stimulating in so many different areas. We've got a lot to investigate. More to learn, sure, but investigating what we have so far, and there's so many things I could ask you about it, but I know I don't want to take away from the rest of the crowd. So let me just do one question. One of the things that we learned about, you talked about African Americans, increased cardiovascular disease, and the lack of sleep. One of the things that we learned in the hypertension area is the issue of non-dipping blood pressures in African Americans. So you have a white patient with 140/90, black patient 140/90. The creatinine's higher, the LDH hypertrophy, it's all worse in the black person because of the 24-hour blood pressure. A lot of that probably has to do with the sleep, and I'm not sure that it's ever been correlated. And the real question is, we have looked into nocturnal non-dipping and blood pressures. It occurs in US blacks who are urban or rural, African blacks who are urban but not rural.
Yeah.
And so the question is the sleep? Does that follow that urban-rural planter?
Well, so honestly, I don't know the data. I have to go find out. This was urban blacks. Actually, there are very few rural blacks here because much of the black population is urban. And so you sample size issues with doing rural black population. But sleep is a major issue, could also be stress. We started measuring stress by looking at cortisol levels in the hair, and I was stunned. This is not our data, but they have published already. In African Americans, the cortisol levels are 6 times higher on average than a white person's cortisol. So that is a source of constant stress within the population. That reflects in lack of sleep, increased cardiovascular health. So unless we get to understand those factors, and they're all social dynamics, how do we understand that? And if we can address that, we can't just say, oh, let's have more coverage, let's have more treatment, we have medicine so that we can treat more black people. No, we need to understand what this cause is and how to address the root.
Okay. And it's interesting that it does improve dramatically with diet. And
Yes.
The Million Hearts program showed that taking a black person and improving the diet had a much more dramatic effect than other races in their million veterans. And so we really have a lot to learn and do in that community. Doesn't explain why South Asians are higher than African Americans and Appalachian whites are equal to African Americans. Probably some of the same dynamics. But let's open up to other folks in the audience.
Question.
Yes.
I was struck by your slide that showed the corridor in Eastern Kentucky was, I think it was a high cardiovascular disease.
No, poor sleep.
Oh, for sleep.
Yes.
But it was also the greenest part, one of the greenest parts of our state.
Yes, right.
So,
Yes.
and all the people in the West doomed, when the flyovers are, they're all brown and stuff, and we're green.
Well, so if you have greenness around you at 1 kilometer, it doesn't make any difference. You'd have to have greenness near the homes, right? Which they don't. And then there are other factors that may override any effects of greenness. If people ask me all the time, well, what about the rural areas? In rural areas, health is even worse. And that has to do with food and other things, lack of physical activity, whatever the reasons are. So greenness has a small effect, but cannot compensate for all of that. But I think the other thing is they really don't have greenness very much around where they are, because they have so much greenness they really don't understand, well, we should have a garden here, or we should have things very, very close to us.
Is that going to be a problem for the fast food places in your green areas in rural?
Yes, so we are thinking about that, is that maybe we should green the fast food areas, because if they're going to be sort of people who are idle and they're with high levels of pollution, they need green buffers around those areas. Yes, sir.
Simple question maybe, but you show the window with a view study. Does it have to be
actual plants and things outside, or could it just be a projection of outside?
So I don't know, maybe they could create a whole plastic garden outside, but that this was an actual thing, so I don't know anybody studied that. But there is, even if you are virtual reality, they show that even if you exercise in a room that's green or blue, then you can exercise much better than if it's yellow or red. Right? So just having the color green helps. Even watching nature scenes on a computer monitor can lower your levels of stress.
Yeah, I was just saying, I mean, you can't change what's outside of a window in many instances, but you can.
You can put virtual reality.
Yeah.
That's right. So, yes.
You mentioned the salutary effect of higher altitude, and it got me thinking about higher levels of 2,3 BPG in people who live at higher altitudes to help facilitate oxygen delivery. And then with the correlation between greenness and better outcomes in cardiovascular disease, thought about oxygen production by the trees. Has that been studied specifically?
Yeah, so we don't know. It seems that maybe in a local area, it is not the oxygen because the gradients are not so steep to make a significant difference, even if you have trees. But overall, so the studies that show that there is a decrease in the levels of heart disease during the summer months. In the northern hemispheres, because we shed all the levels trees, so we have low oxygen dips in the winters. So maybe there's lower levels of oxygen in winter that contributing to excessive winter mortality. But in a neighborhood context, I don't think there's such large gradients to do that.
Stop having deciduous trees and plant more.
No, they have better shade, they have better biodiversity and so on, but we should have a mix. And some of the boreal forests in the north have been very helpful. And that's very unfortunate. In Canada, you have fires, you'll be losing the boreal forests. And so those are they actually are almost as important as the Amazon. But we don't realize how their importance and how easily we can lose them. Yes.
Do we know yet, if greenifying the personal environment is helpful? So in other words, when I'm in clinic next, should I start telling my patients to load up on houseplants? Do we have any evidence that that indoor greenness makes a difference to health?
So there is evidence, although I'm not sure I'm completely convinced. NASA has a list of 10, 12 plants that are indoor plants that are good at removing air toxins. And you can go to the website and look at those plants that NASA. The evidence supporting that is, I would think, rather shaky. But NASA is trying to develop some ideas. And I was invited to this workshop at MIT about the Mars expedition. So if you're going to send people to Mars, they told me that you talk about environment, what types of environment would we take with us that we cannot live without to go to Mars? And so we talked about maybe the greenness, and so they did a lot of study in the space shuttle and so on, putting this green plants could make a difference. But I don't know what they do on Earth. And then then going back to the point of the virtual reality, they created a virtual reality that they opened up the Skylab, they could see the beach and the mountains, and the astronauts hated it. They said it makes us feel worse. If we had not seen anything, it'd be okay. But you can't just show us tantalizingly the picture of the Earth, and then we know we can't go there for 3, 4, 5 months. Yeah. So.
Okay. Well, sorry. What's another question? Okay. Well, this has been absolutely marvelous, very instructive, and hopefully stimulating a lot of people to get more into their own personal, but the community. As well as in the healthcare arena to think about environments so much more and so differently. So thank you very much for this transformational lecture.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
That was very good.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.